behind her. Then he swung round and approached the table eagerly. Now, why is the speaker thankful to her?
The speaker is thankful to her as he wanted the as he wanted Mrs. Hall to leave his room because he wanted to eat his meal in privacy.
और सर्व भी तो किया था उसने लंच भाई. वो बोलते ही नहीं हो आप. देखो यहाँ पे सर्व उसने कहा योर लंच इज सर्व्ड सर. उसके बाद उसने बोला थैंक यू. ही सेड एट द सेम टाइम and did not stir until she had closed the door.
The stranger
So she was
thanked Mrs. Hall for
serving him the lunch and for giving him the privacy in which he wanted to eat his food. दोनों चीजें लिखोगे. Why did he approach the table eagerly?
because he was hungry.
Because he was hungry. Who is her mentioned in the above extract?
Mrs. Hall.
So her is Mrs. Hall. Name the lesson and the writer.
Lesson is the strange man's arrival and the writer is Mrs. H.G. Wells.
What a surprise those bandages did give me, to be sure. Who is the speaker?
The speaker is Mrs. Hall.
So the speaker is Mrs. Hall. Whose bandages she is speaking about?
Stranger's bandages.
So she is speaking about the bandages on the strange man's face. What was she doing at the time of speaking?
She was putting some coal and opening the clothes stand and putting the stranger's coat for drying
On it. So she was putting the coal, unfolding the clothes stand, and lay the traveler's coat upon it. What was she doing? ये तो हो गया. Why was the person's face bandaged?
According to Mrs. Hall, the person might have had an accident or an operation which might have disfigured his face, which was why it was covered in bandages.
And उसका क्या opinion था? That he looked like a.
He looked like a diving. He looked like
His face.
His face looked like as if he was wearing a diving
हेलमेट.
helmet.
HELMET. यहाँ पे लिखा हुआ है कि उसने गॉगल्स भी पहनी हुई थी. ही लुक्ड मोर लाइक अ डाइविंग हेलमेट देन अ मैन. तो उसको ऐसा लग रहा था डाइविंग हेलमेट है जैसे वो. Why did the stranger ask for matches?
The stranger asked for matches as his pipe was out.
How did Mrs. Hall make the stranger comfortable as he arrived?
Mrs. Hall provided the stranger with a guest room oh, and lighted the fireplace.
Lighted नहीं होता, lit the
And
fireplace.
lit the fireplace.
Prepared the meal.
the meal for him and served it in style for him.
ऐसे ये पॉइंट्स बना सकते हो आप. Gave him the guest parlor या provided him the guest parlor or the guest room. Lit the fire. Number 2. Number 3, prepared meal for him. Number 4, laid the table in style and then served the lunch to
Served the
him.
lunch to him.
5 points. How did Mrs. Hall make stranger comfortable? ये तो हो गया. How did Mrs. Hall's nephew get hurt?
Mrs. Hall's nephew got a cut on his arm by a scythe when he fell on the
क्या बोल रहे हो यार?
on the paddy field.
वाह, वाह, वाह.
hay field.
ऐसे लिखना है. He cut his arm with the scythe on which he tumbled in the hay field. Why did Mrs. Hall have pity on the stranger?
Mrs. Hall had pity on the stranger as she thought that he might have got an accident or had an operation which might have disfigured his face and he was wrapped in bandages.
And that is why he was wrapped in bandages. What did the stranger ask Mrs. Hall to leave when she was taking his wet overcoat to dry?
The stranger asked Mrs. Hall to leave his cat when he was taking.
Leave his cat?
Leave his hat.
Leave his hat. बाकी यहीं से when she was taking his wet overcoat to dry. What did she forget to serve in the meal for the guest? So she forgot to serve mustard in the meal for the guest. What sound did Mrs. Hall hear in the kitchen after she served?
Mrs. Hall heard the sound of chirk chirk which was coming when he was when he was whisking the spoon on the plate on in the round the bowl.
हाँ जी, तो ये आंसर यहाँ पे लिखा है. It was she heard the sound of chirk chirk. It was the sound of the spoon whisking around the bowl. What did the stranger ask Mrs. Hall to get from the station? So the stranger asked Mrs. Hall to get
his
luggage from the station. What was the name of the station? Bramblehurst
Station.
ये यहाँ पे लिखा हुआ है, याद होना चाहिए. Bramblehurst Station. Hurst. और यहाँ पे station. And what was the name of her sister's son? That is her
Tom.
nephew, Tom. और स्काइथ की स्पेलिंग क्या है? SCYTHE. Very well, sir, she said. As you like. In a bit, the room will be warmer. What is the source of the extract?
The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells.
Who said these lines to whom?
Mrs. Hall said these lines to the stranger man.
Who made? To the stranger. या लिखो to the strange man. Stranger man कुछ नहीं होता. उठ के लो. Who made no answer after hearing these lines?
The stranger made no answer after hearing these lines.
What year of the month is referred to here? February. The strange man's arrival is taken from which extract?
The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells.
Dash was the name of maidservant.
Millie.
Millie. MILLIE. The stranger face was covered from head to toe, covered with bandages. He was wearing what color of goggles?
Blue.
Blue. Seeing this, what did Mrs. Hall think that he looked like?
A diving helmet.
He looked as if he was wearing a
diving
diving helmet. Meaning of resolutory?
With determination.
Now, describe the manner of the strange man's arrival at the inn.
The stranger came at the inn on a very cold and windy day in February, carrying a little black pod mantle in his thickly gloved hand. He was fully
Wrapped up.
He was fully wrapped up from his head to feet in bandages, and the brim of his hat hid every inch of his face except the tip of his nose. He staggered into the inn looking very exhausted and demanded for a room and a fireplace.
To warm himself. Why did Mrs. Hall consider it a good fortune to have a stranger at the inn?
Mrs. Hall considered it a good fortune to have a stranger at the inn because guests were scarce in winter. Having a guest, let alone a guest who did not haggle over the money.
What did Mrs. Hall do to show herself worthy of the good fortune?
To show herself worthy of a good fortune, Mrs. Hall prepared the meal for the guest with her own hands. She carried plates, cloth, and glasses into the room and laid the table in style for him.
Why was Mrs. Hall so surprised when she went into the parlor the second time?
When Mrs. Hall went into the parlor the second time, she was surprised to see that the stranger was fully covered, that the stranger's forehead above his goggles as well as his ears was covered in bandages. फिर क्या था?
Moreover, the stranger held a napkin.
Moreover, the stranger held a napkin over the lower part of his face, which left no part of his face to be exposed except his nose. Or the collars of his jacket were turned up, and his black thick hair
to cover his neck.
And
तो कॉलर कवर कर रहे थे नेक को, एंड थिक ब्लैक हेयर स्टक आउट
below, giving him the stranger's appearance.
स्टक आउट यहाँ पे बिलो की स्पेलिंग गलत नहीं है, BELOW आना चाहिए. स्टक आउट बिलो एंड बिटवीन द बैंडेजेस, मतलब उसके बाल बैंडेजेस के बीच में से निकल रहे थे. गिविंग हिम द स्ट्रेंजर्स अपीयरेंस, या गिविंग हिम अ स्ट्रेंज अपीयरेंस. व्हाट डिड मिसेस हॉल थिंक to be the reason behind the bandages on the stranger's head?
Mrs. Hall thought that the stranger might have had an accident or an operation which might have disfigured his face, which was why it was wrapped in bandages.
What happened when Mrs. Hall tried to ask the stranger about the bandages?
When Mrs. Hall tried to ask the stranger about the bandages, he cut her short by asking for matches, giving an end to their conversation.
तो इसका क्या लिखोगे? डिस्क्राइब द अपीयरेंस ऑफ द स्ट्रेंज मैन या ऑफ द स्ट्रेंजर. क्या क्या फिट करोगे पॉइंट्स?
The stranger's forehead was covered with a.
पहले ये लिखोगे.
The stranger had a little portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand.
He was carrying a little black portmanteau in his thickly gloved
He
hand.
was covered from his head to foot in bandages, and the brim of his hat hid every inch of his face except the tip of his nose. His forehead above the blue goggles was covered with bandages, as well as his ears was covered with bandages, and he held a napkin over his face, which
आई थिंक अपीयरेंस में तो इतना भी बहुत है. ये यहाँ तक नोज वाला है ना, कि फर्स्ट अपीयरेंस तो ऐसी ही थी. अगर ज़्यादा बड़ा आएगा तो और खींच देना, फिर ये वाला पार्ट भी लिख देना, ये वाला जो है ये पूरा, कि व्हेन जब उसने रूम में देखा था उसको तो ऐसी अपीयरेंस थी उसकी उस टाइम पे. डिस्क्राइब द कॉन्वर्सेशन बिटवीन मिसेज हॉल एंड द स्ट्रेंजर व्हेन शी केम टू क्लियर हिज लंच. तब क्या कॉन्वर्सेशन थी? ये तो कॉपी में आई नहीं, आपने लिखा कॉपी क्वेश्चन. What conversation they had when she came to clear his lunch? क्लियर करने का आई थी लंच को. ढूंढते उसको अगला. Why did Mrs. Hall try her best to keep the stranger comfortable even though he was rude to her?
Because the stranger came in the winter season and the guests were very scarce in winter, and the stranger did not haggle over the money.
तो इसमें तो आंसर नंबर 2 को फिट कर देंगे. Mrs. Hall did not like the stranger's behavior.
Mrs. Hall did not like the stranger's behavior because when she was going to ask that why the stranger was wrapped in the bandages, he cut her short by demanding for matches,
ये करो.
which gave an end to their conversation.
अब इसका क्या लिखोगे? कॉन्वर्सेशन क्या हुई थी आफ्टर द लंच? कहाँ पे है? ये वाली कॉन्वर्सेशन है.
हाँ जी, यही है. That after the lunch, the stranger asked Mrs. Hall that how would he get his luggage, which was left at the Bramwellhurst station.
तो ये वाला पार्ट लिखेंगे हम इसमें कि क्या कॉन्वर्सेशन हुई आफ्टर क्लियरिंग द लंच. तो दैट ही आस्क्ड दैट हाउ कुड ही गेट हिज लगेज फ्रॉम द स्टेशन. देन उसके अलावा और क्या कॉन्वर्सेशन हुई? Then she told him about her nephew, that is her sister's son Tom, who cut his arm with a scythe on which he tumbled in the hay field. और क्या पॉइंट लिख सकते हो कॉन्वर्सेशन में? एक मिनट. He was no sir and no laughing matter for those who had to take care my sister. बस. And then when she wanted to know more about the bandages, the reason of the bandages, he cut her the conversation short by asking about the matches.
तो सिर्फ स्टेशन वाला हो गया.
हाँ जी, तो यही लिखेंगे और तो कुछ नहीं है, तो बाकी सारा खींचा ही हुआ है. So this was the conversation that how he could get his luggage from the station, and if he could get the speedy delivery. वो पूछा ना, there is no speedy delivery. He asked how he could get the luggage and he asked how to get the speedy delivery of the same. Then then they had a conversation about
How Hall's nephew
Mrs.
got
Hall's
hurt.
nephew, that is Tom, how he got hurt. Mrs. Hall told about his nephew, how he got hurt. So that's it, guys. Listed and unlisted questions have been discussed. Thank you so much. All the very best. अच्छा, एक पॉइंट और है इसमें याद करना हमने, ये बैक एक्सरसाइज कि इसमें इस चैप्टर में बहुत सारे ईडियम्स यूज हुए हैं. ईडियम्स क्या होते हैं? एक फ्रेज होता है. फ्रेज मीन्स इनकम्प्लीट सेंटेंस, मतलब कुछ वर्ड्स विच आर पुट टुगेदर बट दे हैव डिफरेंट मीनिंग्स ऑफ द इंडिविजुअल वर्ड. एक इंडिविजुअल वर्ड का डिफरेंट मीनिंग होता है, बट अगर हम उनको इकट्ठा जोड़ दें तो वो ईडियम बन जाता है. अब इस पूरे ईडियम का और हर इंडिविजुअल वर्ड का मीनिंग डिफरेंट होता है, एंड मैनी ईडियम्स हैव बीन यूज्ड इन दिस चैप्टर. इसमें से कुछ आप याद कर लो जो शायद आ सकते हैं. तो पुल्ड अप, मोर डेड देन अलाइव, स्नैचिंग एट एन ओपनिंग. तो इन सब का एक्चुअल मीनिंग, जो मीनिंग यहाँ पे दिया हुआ है वो अलग है, बट एक एक वर्ड का मीनिंग देखें तो वो डिफरेंट है. ठीक है. देन अब ये जो इनविजिबल मैन है, द इनविजिबल मैन, जिसमें से ये एक्सट्रैक्ट लिया गया है, वो किसके बारे में स्टोरी है? वो एक साइंटिस्ट के बारे में, और is about a scientist, the stranger in the extract, who makes himself invisible after the research, years of research and experiment. और उसने सबसे पहले एक्सपेरिमेंट किस पे किया था? कैट पे. कैट को इनविजिबल कर दिया था. सिर्फ उसके क्लॉज, ओनली हर इट्स क्लॉज एंड आईज could be seen before he actually became invisible, and then he set the cat free. तो this type of stories कौन सी stories होती हैं? साइंस फिक्शन stories. और ऐसी साइंस फिक्शन स्टोरी H.G. वेल ने और कौन सी लिखी है? द टाइम मशीन एंड द वॉर ऑफ द वर्ल्ड्स. ये नाम याद होने चाहिए. सो थैंक यू सो मच. गुड लक.